They said the woods swallowed her whole. One October night, Clara May Hensley stepped off the porch of her family's farmhouse and disappeared into the thick, whispering dark. Her mother claimed she was only fetching water from the well. Others swore they'd seen her walking barefoot toward the ridge, wearing nothing but her nightgown, humming a lullaby no one recognized. By dawn, all that remained was a strip of fabric snagged on a barbed fence and the uneasy silence that blanketed the valley. For a year, her name was spoken like a curse. The sheriff organized search parties that came back hollow-eyed, muttering about carved symbols and strange animal bones hanging from trees. Her family said nothing. They kept their curtains drawn, their lights dim, and their doors locked even during daylight. It wasn't the first time someone from the Hensley line had gone missing in those woods, but it was the first time anyone cared to ask why. Then one summer evening, nearly 12 months to the day she vanished, Clara returned. She walked out of the forest barefoot, her skin pale as candle wax, her dress torn and stained with dried mud. Her belly was swollen with life, though no one could say whose life it was. When she saw her family's house, she didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stared at the front door as if waiting for it to open itself. The doctor said she'd been through something unspeakable: bruises around her neck, strange burn marks across her thighs, and eyes that darted at every sound. But the most disturbing part wasn't what she'd endured. It was what she carried. The child inside her seemed to twist and move even when there was no heartbeat on the monitor. The family refused further examination, saying only, "She's home now. That's all that matters." But to the townsfolk watching from afar, it was clear something else had come home that night, something ancient, something born of the blood that had always cursed the Hensleys. The evening Clara May disappeared began like any other in the quiet hollow where the Hensleys lived, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills where the sun bled red behind the ridges and the cicadas sang their nightly chorus. The air was thick with the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth, the kind of night when sound traveled slow and heavy. Clara had spent the afternoon hanging laundry behind the house, her white dress brushing against her bare legs, her long hair tied in a simple braid that reached the small of her back. Neighbors later said she seemed distant that day, distracted, as though she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Her mother remembered her pausing mid-sentence at supper, glancing toward the window when the wind shifted, her eyes glassy and far away. Just after dusk, when the sky turned the color of bruised lilac, Clara stepped out onto the porch. She told her mother she was going to fetch water from the old well near the tree line. She didn't take a lantern. She didn't put on shoes. The sound of her footsteps faded into the dark, swallowed by the hum of the woods. Minutes passed, then an hour, and when she didn't return, her mother called out for her. Her voice echoed through the trees, unanswered. When her father finally lit a lantern and followed the narrow dirt path toward the well, he found the rope bucket untouched, swinging slightly as if disturbed by a breeze that wasn't there. A few feet beyond, he found a torn piece of fabric caught on a barbed wire fence, a shred of Clara's dress, stained dark at the edge. The sheriff came before midnight, his boots crunching on the gravel road, his flashlight cutting through the mist that had started to roll down from the ridge. He asked questions the family didn't want to answer, about Clara's state of mind, about anyone she might have seen recently, about why there were strange markings on the trees near their property, symbols carved deep into the bark, like crude crosses or letters from an alphabet no one recognized. The family claimed ignorance, but their trembling hands and lowered eyes told another story. Search parties combed the woods for days, shouting her name into the endless canopy, but the forest remained silent, offering only animal tracks, twisted roots, and the sound of water dripping in the dark. It was as if the earth itself had opened and taken her in, erasing her footsteps, her scent, her very presence, leaving behind only the uneasy stillness that settled over the hollow and the feeling that whatever had taken Clara was still watching, waiting, patient as the hills themselves. When the search began, the townsfolk moved like a tide of flickering lanterns against the dark sprawl of the Appalachian woods. Men with hounds and rifles, women clutching kerosene lamps, even the preacher from the valley came, his Bible pressed against his chest as if the verses inside might keep the evil at bay. The air was wet and cold, heavy with the smell of moss and smoke. Every sound felt amplified: the crunch of boots over fallen leaves, the distant cry of an owl, the soft whisper of branches brushing together as though the forest itself was murmuring secrets. The sheriff organized them into groups and sent them into the hollows, up along the ridges and down near the riverbeds where fog clung low like breath on a mirror. They searched for any trace of Clara May, calling her name until their voices cracked. But the woods gave nothing back except the rustling of unseen things. By the second night, men began to whisper that they had seen strange signs deep in the timber, trees marked with shapes that weren't quite crosses and not quite letters, carved deep and fresh, the edges oozing sap that glistened like blood in the lantern light. Near an old hunting trail, a deputy found a circle of bones arranged with unnatural precision, the skulls of small animals stacked in the center as though part of some quiet ritual. Another man swore he heard singing from the ravine below, a woman's voice low and sweet, carrying the same haunting tune Clara had been humming the evening she vanished. When they reached the place where the sound had come from, there was nothing but water trickling over stones and the faint smell of something decayed. The sheriff tried to keep order, but each passing day stretched thinner than the last. Some searchers refused to return to certain areas, saying the woods changed at night, that paths shifted, trees leaned closer, and lantern light seemed to flicker against faces that weren't there. The dogs refused to track, whining and digging their paws into the mud as if they sensed something human but not alive. The deeper they went, the more it felt as though they weren't the ones searching but being led somewhere, drawn by something unseen that moved just beyond the circle of their lights. By the end of the week, only a few men still went out, and even they stopped speaking Clara's name aloud. When the search finally ended, the sheriff closed his notebook without writing a word. The town returned to its routine, pretending to forget, though every creak of the wind through the pines seemed to echo with her voice, soft and far away, calling for someone who would never find her. After the search parties gave up and the lanterns stopped flickering in the night, the Hensley farmhouse turned inward like a wounded thing. Curtains that once fluttered in the breeze stayed drawn, doors remained locked even in daylight, and the smoke from their chimney thinned to nothing. Neighbors noticed that the family no longer came into town for supplies. The father, Elias Hensley, began sending coins through a boy who refused to step past their gate. The boy said Elias met him at the edge of the property, his face pale and hollow, his eyes darting toward the woods as though he expected something to emerge. When asked about Clara, he said only that the Lord would bring her home when the time was right, his voice shaking as if he didn't quite believe his own words. Inside the house, things grew stranger. The mother, Ruth, was seen in the yard at dawn burying small bundles wrapped in linen beneath the sycamore tree, whispering Clara's name under her breath. The youngest brother, Luke, stopped speaking altogether. Some nights, neighbors swore they could see candlelight moving slowly behind the attic window, flickering like a heartbeat. No one dared to knock. The Hensleys had always been a private family, the kind that kept to themselves and carried their own grief behind closed doors, but after Clara's disappearance, their silence felt heavier, almost deliberate, as though it was protecting something. Rumors spread faster than the wind that howled down the mountain. People began saying the family had angered something old, something that didn't forgive. Others whispered about their bloodline, about how the Hensleys had been marrying cousins for generations, keeping the family name pure, as their great-grandfather used to say. There were stories of children born wrong, with faces that mirrored each other too perfectly, and of weddings held without witnesses deep in the woods. Most dismissed it as backwoods gossip, but those who'd known Clara remembered how fragile she looked, how her father never let her out of his sight. Weeks passed into months, and the town stopped asking questions, but an unease lingered like a bruise no one could see. Late at night, when the wind pressed against the windows and the crickets fell silent, some swore they heard a faint knocking from the direction of the Hensley house, 3 slow taps, like someone begging to be let in. The family never answered. The only sign of life was the faint glow of a single lamp in Clara's old room, burning through the night, as if the Hensleys were waiting for her to come home, or afraid she already had. The whispers began in hushed tones at the general store, carried between nervous glances and lowered voices. People had long known the Hensleys were different, but now, after Clara's disappearance, old rumors rose again like ghosts from the soil. Some said the family came from a forgotten branch of settlers who isolated themselves generations ago, living deep within the Appalachian mountains where law and religion could not reach. They had their own rules, their own customs, and most disturbingly, their own way of keeping the bloodline clean. The elders recalled stories told by their grandparents about a time when the Hensleys refused to marry outside the family, claiming that outsiders diluted their sacred seed. The name had once held respect in the hills, tied to wealth and land, but over time, their lineage began to fold inward, generation after generation, until their faces blurred with uncanny resemblance, and their children spoke in strange, clipped dialects that no longer sounded like English. The forest surrounding the Hensley property was said to be cursed ground. Travelers passing through told of figures watching from the tree line, of animal bones hung like charms from the branches, and of an eerie stillness that fell whenever someone spoke the family's name aloud. Old maps marked that stretch of woods as Hollow's Rest, a place people avoided after dark. Some claimed the Hensleys held ceremonies there, rituals that honored the blood before God, where kin pledged themselves to kin beneath the moon. No one had ever seen such a gathering, but strange sounds had been heard late at night, like chanting carried on the wind. When Clara went missing, these stories resurfaced with new life. Folks began to wonder if her disappearance was no accident but a continuation of something much older and darker. There were whispers that she had been chosen, just as her mother and grandmother before her, to keep the bloodline alive in the only way the Hensleys knew how. Some even said that the marks found carved into trees during the search were not symbols of grief or protection, but the family's ancestral signs, warnings written in a forgotten tongue. A few townsfolk admitted to seeing Elias Hensley near the edge of the woods days before Clara vanished, speaking softly to the trees as though someone was listening from within them. By then, fear had rooted itself in the town's heart. No one wanted to believe such stories, yet no one could explain the strange, watchful silence that seemed to hang over the valley. The Hensley family's isolation no longer seemed like privacy but penance, a way to hide generations of sin that refused to stay buried beneath their mountain soil. Almost a full year had passed since Clara vanished when she finally returned, though many wished she hadn't. It was near dusk on a humid July evening when a boy from town spotted her walking down the dirt road that led from the woods. The light was low and golden, but her figure cut through it like a ghost, barefoot, her skin white as wax, her hair tangled and streaked with mud. Her dress hung off her like an old curtain, torn in places and stiff with dirt, and her belly, swollen and round, told a story no one dared to say aloud. The boy ran to tell the sheriff, but by the time anyone reached her, she was already standing on the front porch of her family's farmhouse, her hand resting against the door as though she wasn't sure it would open for her. When her mother answered, witnesses said she didn't scream or cry out. She just stared, her face drained of all color, her lips trembling as if words had been stolen from her throat. Clara stepped inside without a sound, her eyes glassy, unfocused, like she was looking through the world instead of at it. She didn't speak, not even when her father took her by the shoulders and demanded to know where she'd been. Her lips moved once, forming a shape that could have been a name, but no sound came out. It was as though her voice had been left behind in whatever place had held her for those long months. The doctor from town arrived not long after, summoned quietly under the cover of darkness. He found Clara frail and cold to the touch, with strange bruises along her neck, almost like the marks of a hand that had never quite let go. Her skin bore faint burns in the shape of circles, as if pressed by something heated and deliberate. When he asked about the child she carried, her mother said only that it was meant to be. The doctor noted that Clara flinched at sudden sounds and avoided mirrors, as though she feared her reflection. He tried to question her gently, but every time he mentioned the woods, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. News spread quickly through the valley. Some said she'd been taken by men passing through, others whispered that she had gone willingly to join whatever her family worshipped in the dark. But those who saw her up close swore she didn't look like someone who had simply been lost, she looked like someone who had crossed over into something beyond human understanding and brought a piece of it back with her. Even the air around her seemed heavy, still, as if the forest itself had followed her home and wasn't ready to let her go. The doctor's examination of Clara May was meant to bring answers, but instead it deepened the unease that already wrapped the valley in a slow, suffocating dread. He arrived at the Hensley home one quiet afternoon with his worn leather bag and a face already lined with worry. The house was dim, the curtains still drawn tight despite the bright summer sun outside. The smell of damp earth and old wood filled the air. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, her hands resting gently on her swollen belly. She didn't look up when the doctor entered, and she didn't react when he spoke her name. It was as though her mind had retreated to a place beyond reach. When he examined her, he found things that chilled him in a way no sickness ever had. There were bruises around her neck, faint but unmistakable, the kind left by fingers pressing down with steady, deliberate force. They were too symmetrical to be accidental. On her inner thighs were strange circular scars, dark against her pale skin, as if someone had branded her with something heated and round. Her pulse was weak, her skin clammy, and her eyes darted nervously at the sound of every creak in the floorboards. When the doctor placed his stethoscope on her belly, the child inside shifted, not like any baby he had ever felt before. Its movements were sharp, twisting, almost frantic, as if resisting his touch. He tried to reassure the family, but the father's expression was cold and unreadable. Elias Hensley stood by the door, arms crossed, watching with a quiet intensity that unsettled the doctor. When asked if Clara had been harmed or attacked, Elias simply replied, "The child is a gift, doctor. Don't question where gifts come from." His wife stood behind him, her face pale and wet with tears, nodding silently. The doctor pressed again, saying that what he found wasn't natural, that the marks on Clara's body suggested violence or something ritualistic. Elias told him to pack his bag and leave before sundown. The doctor did as he was told, but the memory lingered. That night, he sat in his office staring at the notes he'd written, unable to explain the feeling that something inside Clara wasn't just living, it was waiting. He recalled her eyes, how they seemed to plead without words, as though she wanted to say something terrible but couldn't. Some said she had been taken by a man during her disappearance, others whispered darker things, that she had been claimed by something older than time, something her family still served in secret. Whatever the truth, the doctor never returned to the Hensley home, and in the years that followed, he refused to speak of that visit again. After the doctor's visit, the Hensley family shut their doors to the world once more. The shutters were nailed closed, and the house seemed to shrink beneath its own weight, the way a body folds in on itself when trying to hide a wound. Neighbors who passed by claimed they never saw Clara outside again. The only signs of life were the faint flickers of lamplight through cracks in the curtains and the occasional shadow moving behind them. Elias Hensley turned away anyone who came asking questions, friends, church members, even the sheriff. He said the matter was family business and that outsiders had no right to meddle in the will of blood. His words carried an edge of warning, and after one encounter that ended with the sheriff's hand hovering near his holster, no one tried again. Inside the house, tension hung like fog. Ruth, Clara's mother, moved quietly through the halls, her eyes red from crying but her lips sealed tight. She seemed torn between love and fear, watching her daughter with a trembling devotion, as though she couldn't decide whether Clara needed to be protected or exorcised. Elias, however, had no such conflict. He treated Clara's condition as a sacred event, muttering prayers in an old dialect no one recognized, burning herbs that filled the rooms with a bitter, choking smell. Whenever Ruth questioned him, he reminded her that their ancestors had done the same, that the bloodline demanded continuation, no matter the cost. Rumors spread quickly, fed by the absence of truth. Some said the family had built a shrine in the cellar, that Elias prayed there each night before dawn, speaking to something that answered back in whispers. Others said they heard crying from the house long after midnight, not Clara's, but a deeper sound, rhythmic and strange, as though the earth beneath the house was breathing. When questioned, Elias only said the child was a gift from within, that no man had touched his daughter, that she carried something chosen, something pure. His words made the townsfolk uneasy because they sounded rehearsed, almost reverent, as though he were repeating a prayer rather than telling the truth. By late autumn, the Hensleys had completely withdrawn. Food was left at their gate by the storekeeper's boy, and each morning, the basket was gone without a word of thanks. No one dared cross the fence line anymore. The house looked hollow by day but alive by night, as if something inside it woke only after darkness fell. The people of the valley began to speak of the Hensleys in the past tense, as if they were already gone, swallowed whole by the same thing that had taken Clara once before, now binding them all in its quiet, inherited curse. The night Clara gave birth began with a storm that rolled over the mountains like a living thing. Thunder rattled the windows of the Hensley farmhouse, and wind howled through the cracks in the old wood, carrying with it the smell of wet soil and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The midwife, a woman named Mrs. Dalton from 3 towns over, had been summoned hours earlier by a messenger boy who would not step foot beyond the gate. When she arrived, she found the house lit by a single lantern, its glow trembling across the faded wallpaper. Elias Hensley met her at the door, his face gaunt and expressionless, and without a word, led her upstairs. Clara lay on the bed drenched in sweat, her eyes wide and vacant, her breath shallow. The air in the room was unbearably still, despite the storm raging outside. Mrs. Dalton could feel something in that stillness, something heavy and wrong, but she said nothing. She had delivered more babies than she could count and knew the signs of fear when she saw them. Ruth knelt beside the bed, clutching her daughter's hand, whispering prayers that broke apart with each cry. Elias stood in the corner, silent, holding a small wooden carving that looked more like an idol than a cross. The labor was long and agonizing. The storm grew louder, lightning flashing through the slits in the shutters, illuminating the strange symbols etched into the walls, markings Mrs. Dalton had never seen before. Each time the thunder cracked, Clara's body convulsed, her screams rising in perfect rhythm with the storm. It was almost as if the sky itself was answering her. Then, as the final cry tore through the house, the thunder stopped, and the world went quiet. When the child was born, the midwife felt her heart stop for a moment. The baby was small but strong, its skin pale as paper, its eyes opening too soon, wide and unblinking, their color an unnatural shade that seemed to shift in the dim light. Elias took the child before she could even clean it, wrapping it in a cloth embroidered with strange black thread. Clara turned her face away, sobbing silently, refusing to look. The midwife whispered that she needed to check both mother and child, but Elias ordered her to leave. His tone was calm, almost gentle, yet final. She gathered her things, trembling, and walked out into the storm. By morning, Mrs. Dalton's horse was found grazing near the river, her bag still strapped to the saddle, but the woman herself was gone. The sheriff searched for her for days, but no trace was ever found. From that night forward, no one saw Clara again at the window, and no one in town dared to speak of the storm that had brought her child into the world. The first time anyone saw the child, unease rippled through the valley like a cold wind. Townsfolk who came close to the Hensley property swore the baby's eyes were wrong, too large, too bright, almost reflective, like mirrors that caught more than the light. Some claimed the gaze followed them even when they stepped back to the edge of the road, lingering in a way that was impossible for a newborn. Mothers whispered that their own children had cried at the sight of it, and even the Hensley family seemed unsettled, speaking to the child in low, hurried tones, as though worried that the wrong word might awaken something within. It wasn't just the color or shape of the eyes, it was what seemed to hide behind them, a familiarity too precise, as though the face carried memories not its own. Neighbors noticed that the child never made ordinary sounds. Instead of cries or coos, there were strange, almost musical tones, vibrating in the room like a tuning fork set to some unnatural frequency. Even when Elias and Ruth tried to soothe it, rocking it in their arms, the baby would stop only for moments, staring into corners of the room that held nothing visible. Some nights, townsfolk reported hearing the sound of soft laughter emanating from the Hensley house, a dry, hollow sound that didn't belong to a human voice. Dogs that wandered too close would growl or flee, their hackles raised as if sensing a predator invisible to human eyes. The child's resemblance to the family was uncanny, but not in the gentle way that kin sometimes mirror one another. Instead, there was a precision to it, a mirror of generations compressed into a single fragile body. Elders who glimpsed the baby swore it bore the face of someone long dead, an ancestor whose name had vanished from memory. Some claimed that the baby's features shifted subtly in the dim light, as though the face itself were not fixed, cycling through echoes of the bloodline. Even Elias would glance at the child with a tense, watchful gaze, and Ruth sometimes muttered prayers under her breath, clutching the infant as if trying to hold back forces that could not be stopped. The town tried to keep its distance, but curiosity mingled with fear. Travelers passing through reported seeing a pale figure holding the child at the window late at night, the lantern casting shadows that made the baby's eyes shine like twin moons. Those who watched too long felt nausea, chills, and a deep, inexplicable sorrow, as though the weight of generations pressed down upon them. No one knew whether it was the child itself or the Hensley house that carried the sense of dread, but one thing was clear: something had been born that night, something both human and impossibly old, and the eyes of that child reflected a truth too unsettling to speak aloud, hinting at a legacy that refused to die. It wasn't until a visiting historian came across old church records that the full weight of the Hensley family's secret began to take shape. The ledger was brittle, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible under careful inspection. Names appeared again and again, lines folding back on themselves, fathers marrying distant cousins, children bearing the same surnames as their grandparents. At first, it seemed like ordinary genealogy, a quirk of isolated mountain life. But as the historian traced the lineage further, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Generations had looped in on themselves, creating a web of kinship so tangled that a single child carried the genetic imprint of nearly every branch of the family. It was not just inbreeding, it was a deliberate folding of the bloodline, a centuries-long practice that the family had kept hidden from outsiders. Cross-referencing these records with old burial documents revealed something more disturbing. Graves marked with Hensley names contained bodies that were decades apart in age but shared uncanny physical similarities. The historian noted how the faces in the photographs, taken for church records and family portraits, seemed to echo one another, each generation mirroring the last with alarming precision. The historian's notes grew frantic with observation. Certain names appeared in multiple roles: father, uncle, cousin across overlapping generations. The child Clara carried might not just have been the product of a single twisted union, it could represent the culmination of generations of folding the blood inward, a living embodiment of the family's obsessive control over lineage. The townsfolk, when told some of these findings, reacted with disbelief and unease. They had always sensed that the Hensleys were strange, their home and their family steeped in silence and shadow, but no one had imagined the true extent of it. Even the historian admitted that what the records suggested was almost incomprehensible, a family that had deliberately shaped its own future through secrets and isolation, bending generations to serve an ancient idea of purity, unconcerned with morality, law, or even the natural order. In the months following, the story of Clara and her child became almost mythic in the valley. Some claimed the baby itself carried the weight of all those generations, an innocent body harboring the accumulated consequence of centuries of choices made in secret. Others whispered that the forest surrounding the Hensleys had absorbed the echoes of their deeds, that the trees and soil remembered every union, every whispered vow, every concealment of what had been done in darkness. It became clear to anyone willing to look that the mystery of Clara's disappearance, her return, and the birth of her child was inseparable from the history of her bloodline. The past had folded into the present, and in that folding, the Hensley legacy revealed a truth too horrifying to confront directly, that the father of her child might not have been outside the family or even outside the living, and that the curse of their blood was far from finished.